Hey guys, Foxdrop here with a video on ranked anxiety. Chances are when queuing up for a ranked game, a lot of you have felt the jitters. Cold hands, faster heartbeat, that kind of thing. And for some of you, it may even be so bad that it stops you from wanting to queue up and play altogether. The difference between this video and the other resources online on the topic is that I'm going to put a large emphasis on giving you the fundamental understanding of ranked anxiety, what it is, why it happens, and how you can cope with it. Because as weird as it sounds, just having a good understanding of the subject will help reduce the effects of your anxiety. I really want to emphasize that this isn't going to be a checklist like quick tips for dealing with anxiety, therapists hate him. I don't think that's an effective way to tackle a problem like anxiety, and so that's where I'm going to focus on really educating you guys about the concept itself. Now this is a complex subject, so I brought my friend Kashade along, who is a researcher in the science of emotions. So to start things off, scientifically speaking, Kashade, what is ranked anxiety?
Well, as you just described, there are certain symptoms that you would usually associate with this experience of anxiety. But more scientifically speaking, we would say that anxiety is referred to as a kind of emotional state that motivates you and creates physiological support for avoidance behavior, you could say.
So what you're saying is that when you get anxious, you start avoiding things.
Yes, I mean, your body starts preparing you to distance yourself. The feeling of anxiety is basically triggered by you perceiving a situation as threatening and by you not having a clear way to cope with it, and just generally the situation feels outside of your control.
And I guess in a game like League, there are loads of uncontrollable elements, seeing as it is a team game after all. Now you're saying that this anxiety occurs when you're faced with a threatening circumstance. So why is it happening in video games like League of Legends when, you know, it's a video game? Where's that threat coming from?
Well, it is a video game, as you were saying, and it's important to understand it's about your perception, or more specifically, your misperception of what is actually threatening. So your anxiety is basically triggered by your brain asking two different kind of questions. Do I have something at stake? And do I feel like I can cope? These two questions are basically what are known as appraisals.
So what you're saying is that if there's something at stake, you're not able to prevent it or deal with it, then you will feel anxious.
Yes, and it is these appraisals, those that are based on our personal goals, that we can actually change so that anxiety is not triggered in the first place. And if it is triggered, then we can learn how to best deal with it.
Right, so aside from feeling crappy when it happens, why is it so important to deal with this anxiety?
Well, because a game like League of Legends is obviously a competitive experience, and of course then we want to win. To do that, we need to perform at our best, and this anxiety influences our performance.
So essentially you're saying that anxiety will make us play worse.
Fundamentally, yes. However, it's not really that simple because anxiety has both facilitating and inhibiting effects on our performance.
So it's not strictly a bad thing then?
Right. I mean, there are parts of anxiety that can actually help our performance. So to probably understand anxiety and its effect on our performance, we have to look at the individual components that together add up to the experience of anxiety. Because what an emotion actually is a response package that helps us deal with specific situations.
So basically, I'm put in a certain situation, my brain then tries to give me the tools to help me deal with that situation, and those tools are the components of what we call emotions. In the case of League, or whatever game it may be, I'm concerned about not only losing, but not being able to cope with what happens when I do lose. So that then triggers my brain to send out those tools to help me, and as such, I experience what I know as anxiety. Alright then, so with anxiety, what exactly do the tools or the response package contain?
With anxiety, this response package can be divided into two different categories: your bodily components and your cognitive components.
And by your cognitive components, you mean the stuff that's in your mind?
Yeah, exactly.
So these components or symptoms of anxiety are felt in both your body and your mind?
Yeah, I mean, these cognitive components are not necessarily felt by you, they're more unconscious. And we're basically talking about your cognitive abilities, such as your decision making, your attention, your thinking, and stuff like that. And we're looking at how these are affected by your anxiety.
And how does your anxiety affect these cognitive components?
Well, for instance, it leads to a negative attentional bias, which means that we will start focusing on the negatives. And if there's nothing specifically negative going on in the game, then our attention will be turned inwards and we will start focusing on our own self-defeating ideas and our thoughts and feelings that leads us to doubt ourselves and our ability to win, you could say. And this all leads to the feeling that we know as being worried.
So when we're feeling worried and trapped in our own head with these negative thoughts, how does that then influence our in-game performance? Does that make it harder to make the plays?
Yeah, I mean, this component of anxiety is definitely one of the inhibitory ones. When we are focused on irrelevant stuff like our own self-defeating ideas and thoughts, then we're not really focused on the game anymore. And being worried like this takes up a lot of our cognitive resources. And these resources, they're not exactly infinite, they're limited. So this basically works the same way when you look in your computer in your task manager and you see that League of Legends.exe is opened and it takes up 80% of your resources to run optimally. Then what do you think happens when an additional program is open called worry.exe and that one takes up 60% of our resources?
I suppose something that's not exactly a good thing.
No, not quite. But this wouldn't be a problem if we had a way of closing this new anxiety program. But the very fact that it's opened in the first place means that our brain doesn't exactly know by itself how to close it. And without the right tools, we can't do it manually either.
So going back to the task manager, anxiety.exe is taking a load of our resources that we need for league.exe to run properly, which means that poor old league.exe is now operating sub-optimally. Now outside of that analogy, this basically means that anxiety hinders your league skill.
Right. And being worried like this takes up a lot of our resources by making us monitor and overanalyze our own actions.
So we start overthinking things.
Yeah, and this overthinking happens on a step-by-step basis, which means that errors can happen on each of these steps. So you're basically becoming extremely aware of your own actions and decisions that were otherwise second nature or automatic to you.
So say you're using your flash in League. Normally this would be a split-second instinctive action, but if you were asked to explain every single step involved in its execution, you'd have to talk about putting your cursor in the desired position, accounting for flash's range, moving your finger over to the flash key, pressing the key, releasing the key. When you actually think about it, there are loads of steps involved in using your flash.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And the more steps you take, the more resources it requires, and the more steps you can potentially fail.
So if anxiety leads to worry and worry leads to bad performance, then what were you talking about earlier when you mentioned that anxiety could actually have a facilitating, or in other words, positive influence?
Yeah, I mean, I know it can sound like anxiety is just flat out bad, but it's important to consider the intensity of your anxiety as well. Like having anxiety of a low or no intensity means that you're easily distracted by things outside the game and you're not really focused on the task at hand. But if you're too anxious, that means that you can't really focus on you can only really focus on tasks on a micro level. So, for instance, you would focus on your mechanics, but you would completely neglect the minimap, and neither of these are good in a game like League of Legends.
So do you mean to say that you're better off with a certain level of anxiety than having none at all, in order to maintain decent focus in the game?
Basically, yes. An intermediate level of anxiety or emotional activity is generally where you find your optimal level of performance for complex tasks like League of Legends.
So to sum up about these cognitive or mental elements of anxiety, what you're essentially saying is that our brains have limited resources, and when we feel anxious, that takes up a lot of that brain space. And this is problematic because we also need those resources to perform at our best in games. But it's also true that a certain amount of anxiety can be useful to help keep us focused and to not space out. So if that's the cognitive stuff, what about the bodily symptoms?
There are a few, and I'm sure you can relate to them if you ever felt anxiety yourself. It's things like having a faster heart rate, faster breathing, sweating more, that kind of thing. And your blood also moves from your extremities into your larger muscle groups, which is essentially your body preparing itself to run away from this perceived threat.
But in League, there's obviously nothing you actually need to physically run away from.
No, but the motivation that comes from it is still there, so you're still motivated to distance yourself, which is why you end up avoiding ranked games in the future.
So when your body is preparing to run from this threat and your blood leaves your hands, does this explain why they can start to feel cold?
Yes, exactly.
So what can we do to stop these cold hands, the shivers and stuff like that? How do we stop feeling the anxiety?
I mean, it's not necessarily about not feeling the anxiety, but more like not having negative feelings about the anxiety and just accepting it. For instance, if you are feeling afraid or worried about the experience of anxiety, then you will actually end up escalating it and making it more likely to be triggered in the future because it is clear to you that you're no longer in control.
So there's this vicious cycle of feeling anxious about feeling anxious, which then leads you to feel anxious and so on forever, and that eventually leads you to not want to play the game anymore.
Yeah, I mean, your perception of ranked games are being negatively reinforced by this vicious cycle that you just mentioned. And that in turn will make you play worse in games, and then that will act as a self-fulfilling prophecy for your negative perceptions.
So you're genuinely playing worse in your games, which is due to your anxiety, but your anxiety is also fueled by you playing worse in your games. Now that sounds pretty rough, so how do we break that cycle?
Well, breaking this cycle, it all comes down to how you welcome your feeling of anxiety. Like, if you dread the feeling, it will only make it worse. But if you realize and accept that it's just a normal part of any competitive environment, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, then it will have much less of an impact on your gameplay. So it's important to try to demystify this experience by understanding anxiety.
How do we demystify anxiety? How do we change the way we perceive it?
Well, part of that process is what we've already been doing and already been talking about through this video. The knowledge of it alone will change your perception of what anxiety actually means, and therefore it will end up altering the way you react to it.
I know they say knowledge is power, but that all sounds kinda overwhelming. So what happens if simply understanding the anxiety doesn't help me deal with it?
If the knowledge itself is not enough, then you can try to prove to yourself that you are actually in control of these things by learning how to manipulate these, the bodily components we mentioned earlier that are associated with anxiety.
You mean like controlling whether or not your hands are cold?
Yes, your body's emotional components, both the physical and cognitive ones, are basically interconnected into what we would refer to as a feedback loop, where if you change one part of this loop, it will influence the other parts of the emotional system too. So, for instance, you can slow down your breathing when you feel anxious, and that will imitate how you normally feel when you're more relaxed, and then that signal will be sent to the rest of the emotional system, and then the rest of the components will start to feel more relaxed as well, and all this will lead to a lessen in the intensity of your anxiety.
Are you saying that it's possible to trick your mind into feeling a certain emotion by imitating the physical components of that emotion? Or in the case of anxiety, you can trick your mind into not feeling anxious by changing the stuff like how cold your hands are by warming them?
Yes, exactly. But you need to deliberately maintain these changes until you're no longer aware that you're doing them, because every time you start to feel the anxiety again, you need to repeat the process, and eventually these changes, they will become like second nature or habitual to you, and then you don't have to put like the conscious effort into doing them. So your anxiety will basically learn how to regulate itself.
So if you keep warming your hands or slowing down your breathing and that kind of thing, is that all it really takes to regulate your anxiety?
Not by itself. If you don't change your appraisals or your misperception that triggered your anxiety in the first place, like we talked about in the beginning of the video, then it will just keep triggering.
So it's kind of like you're standing there and Morgana walks up to you and she shoves her W down onto you. Her W is damaging you every second until you move out of it. Now think of her W as a metaphor for anxiety. It doesn't matter how much you warm your hands or attempt to regulate your breathing, if you don't move out of that W, it's going to keep triggering.
Yeah, you could put it like that as well. So, following this analogy, then you'd need to learn how to move out of that W. You can attempt to do this by changing the way you view your anxiety deliberately. And the central premise of that is that you, through conscious and purposeful thinking, can change the unconscious appraisals. And you're doing this by asking yourself thought-provoking questions that will lead to you thinking more rationally about things.
And a thought-provoking question could be something like, what's the worst that could happen?
Yes, but you have to answer it from a rational perspective. You can't just say, what's the worst that could happen, or the world could end. The goal of these questions is more to make you reevaluate your self-defeating ideas and misperception, and then lead to a self-discovery of sorts.
So basically you're trying to convince yourself that you don't actually have anything at stake.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so because of the knowledge of how the feedback loop works, we know that treating the physical symptoms of anxiety will lessen the mental symptoms as well. Is there a way that we can do that the other way around? Because so far what we've learned about the mental side of anxiety all relates to prevention, or helping us stop the anxiety from happening in the first place.
Well, unfortunately, when you are feeling anxious, it's hard to stop these negative thoughts and feelings. So in order to regain your control, you need to try to distract yourself by shifting your focus onto another cognitively demanding task.
So if I'm in Champ Select and start feeling nervous, I could try chill out by watching a stream.
Whereas anything that's relaxing to you is obviously a good thing when you're dealing with anxiety. Watching a stream might not be the best because it's not demanding enough to adequately distract yourself from your negative thoughts. What you need to do is something that requires your full attention, something that's not second nature to you.
What about something like trying to recount the alphabet backwards, doing a Sudoku, that kind of thing?
Yes, I mean, it is those kind of things. And statistically, what seems to have the most effect in video games like League of Legends is to try to think out loud and try to commentate on your own games, because then you can focus on elements that you can control. And this works because it turns your attention outwards again, and thereby it's countering the internalizing effects that anxiety has on your attention, and it reestablishes your sense of control.
So on an ending note, is there anything specific to League that we can do to help cope with this anxiety?
Anything that enhances your self-confidence and your feeling of control will help. So things like playing champions you're most comfortable with, and trying to play in your best role. It is also important that you keep playing and keep joining ranks even if it feels uncomfortable, because the repeated exposure to ranked and the anxiety will lessen its intensity over time. It will become habituated to you. Playing also gives you a chance to prove that your negative expectations about the game didn't come true.
So to sum up what we've talked about today, you'll be better at coping with your anxiety just by knowing more about it. A combination of changing your overall outlook and dealing with the symptoms will go a long way to lessening your anxiety. And a better grasp of your anxiety means a better performance and a more enjoyable experience. I think that should do it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks to Kashade for providing his knowledge on the topic and helping with the vid. I hope you enjoyed it. If you found it useful, feel free to share it with your mates who might also be interested in learning more about dealing with their ranked anxiety. Feel free to give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, and you can subscribe to me for more Educational League content with a bit of entertaining stuff on the side too. You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, and catch me streaming on Twitch as well. All those links are in the description, guys, but thanks so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in my next video.